Money, money, money. It's what the mafia is all about, and some mobsters do better than others. One of those who did very well was a Gambino capo named Carmine Lombardozzi. He and his regime perfected one racket scheme so well that the news media dubbed him the King of Wall Street. And while he had a few bumps along the way, for much of his underworld career, Carmine Lombardozzi's road was indeed paved with gold. This is that story. In his time, Carmine Lombardozzi was known as one of the premier racketeers operating in Brooklyn and Manhattan. He was active in many varied enterprises, but among his most notorious activities was heading a multi-million-dollar loan shark operation and the many stolen stocks and forged securities scams that he perpetrated against Wall Street's brokerage houses. He had the well-earned reputation as a Shylock, and that he often loaned money to smaller loan sharks to finance their operations. Many members of his personal crew were encouraged to push money on the street to increase the overall bankroll generating revenue for the regime. The regime often leveraged these debts to infiltrate businesses of people who couldn't pay, and stock brokerage houses that Lombardozzi thereafter pilfered by busting out or falsely bankrupting the company, or to pressure stockbrokers into committing illegal acts in order to pay back the usurious loans. Stock market manipulation and securities thefts became another endeavor of his regime. It's been well documented that most of his personal crew and criminal associates were also engaged in both these activities. In fact, Lombardozzi garnered his nickname of the Doctor and the King of Wall Street because of his expertise in this field of stock manipulations. He and his minions engineered many stock frauds over the years. One of their primary schemes was operating boiler rooms, which were nothing more than backroom offices minimally furnished with makeshift desks and swivel chairs, a wall of telephones, the accompanying A to Z Coles books listing potential scam victims, and blackboards in order to chalk their sales. Stacked with conmen and smooth-talking criminals, the fraudsters would cold call thousands of unsuspecting stock investors throughout the United States daily, touting stocks that were largely worthless in order to pump up their volume and subsequent value. Once these penny stocks were sufficiently elevated in price, the corrupt stockbrokers, racketeers, and mafiosi would then quickly dump their stock certificates before the securities would plummet back down to near zero value after having been falsely inflated in the first place. The wise guys all made a killing, and the suckers got fleeced. This is a well-worn scam known as pump and dump that has been duplicated numerous times over the years, but arguably Carmine Lombardozzi and his crew were the first to perfect the racket. It earned him and his underworld benefactors millions, and it would make the Doctor the fair-haired boy of the New York Mafia for years to come. Of medium height and slim in stature, Carmine was a very dapper dresser, and was known to tool around his Brooklyn hangouts of Sheepshead Bay and Mill Basin in a white Rolls Royce that he prized. Always dressed to the nines in expensive attire and diamond jewelry, he often congregated in the bars and restaurants that dot Emmons Avenue in Sheepshead Bay, where he held court with his mob disciples and mafia contemporaries. Other favorite hangouts were the Golden Gate Motel in Sheepshead Bay and the New Corners Restaurant at 7201 Fifth Avenue. In Lower Manhattan, he was known to frequent the Alto Nights social club on Kenmare Street and the Café Royale on Mulberry Street, both notorious mob hangouts in the Little Italy section since the 1930s. He gained much additional unwanted notoriety in 1957 when he was one of 62 top mafiosi nabbed at the infamous Appalachian Mafia meeting in upstate New York. This underworld gathering for a mob barbecue at Binghamton boss Joseph Barbera's home would lead to multiple appearances before grand juries investigating the event and the mafia in general. He would end up serving a contempt sentence because of his continued refusal to testify truthfully before the panel. He was also eventually convicted on obstruction of justice charges and sentenced to 5 years, but his conviction, like all those charged, was subsequently reversed on appeal. Of all his many mob associates and criminal colleagues was Artie Tortorello, who was one of Carmine's closest and most trusted soldiers through the years. Artie Todd and his brother Peter, also known as Petey Todd, were notorious Brooklyn hoods who served in his regime. The Tortorellos became top mafiosi in their own right. Artie Todd in particular was a violent, scheming hood who was arrested many times over the years. On several occasions, he and his capo regime were nabbed together in several highly publicized indictments out of both the southern and eastern districts of Manhattan and Brooklyn, respectively. Aside from the previously mentioned lucrative rackets, Lombardozzi and his large crew of followers were active in crap games, bookmaking, numbers, vending machines and jukeboxes, fencing stolen shipments, strong-arm work, and suspicion of murder. Lombardozzi was also long suspected by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, or FBN, of dabbling behind the scenes in the narcotics trade as a financier of drug shipments. Carmine was closely tied to his brothers and several nephews, all of whom became active hoodlums in his Gambino family crew. Several of them would go on to become top mafiosi in their own right, such as his nephews Danny Marino and George Lombardozzi. The doctor's brothers, John and Paul, were especially active in the rackets, working side by side with Carmine for many years. What follows is a relatively accurate depiction of what the Lombardozzi crew's membership looked like from the decade starting in 1950 through approximately 1985. Lombardozzi had a very large regime, suspected of having several dozen inducted soldiers serving in it, and many more hoodlum associates. Some of his soldiers included the following: Carmine's brother, John Lombardozzi. Born in 1915, he was a Brooklyn and Miami Beach resident active in stock thefts and the fencing racket, stock fraud, shylocking, and extortion. John also ran gambling junkets from a 747 travel club in Manhattan through several frontmen. He figured into a major stock theft indictment of numerous Lombardozzi crew associates for the theft of over $1.3 million in blue-chip securities. He also served a 20-month jail term for beating FBI agent John Foley, while Foley was surveilling the funeral of Lombardozzi's father, Camillo, in 1963. Anthony Sonny Lombardozzi, Paul Lombardozzi, and Dominic Lombardozzi, three of Carmine's brothers who were all Brooklyn residents and were closely allied with Carmine and John in their shylocking, extortion, and gambling operations. Sabato Sammy Mintz Muro, also known as Little Sammy. Little Sammy had a police record started in 1933 with about a dozen arrests. He was active as a strong arm in gambling and extortion. Muro is also the father of the girl with whom Lombardozzi had an illicit affair and got pregnant. After Muro brought a formal complaint to family bosses Albert Anastasia and Carlo Gambino, Lombardozzi was forced to divorce his wife and marry the young girl, thereby saving her honor and that of her father. It was a merciful decision for Lombardozzi, who could justifiably have been murdered for such a major mafia indiscretion. Artie Todd Tortorello was probably Carmine's closest associate aside from his brothers and nephews. Artie resided in Brooklyn all his life and was a top racket figure. His criminal record started in 1929 and included over 32 arrests. He was a strong-arm and enforcer and active in burglary, extortion, stock frauds and thefts, shylocking, forgeries, and fencing stolen goods. Artie's brother, Petey Todd, was born in 1915 and also resided in Brooklyn for much of his life. He was engaged in burglary and thefts, extortion, and strong-arm work in tandem with his brother and Lombardozzi. Carmine's nephew, Danny Marino. He was Carmine's sister's son. Marino was also one of the several family members arrested for the beating of the FBI agent back in 1963. The incident created a feud and bad blood for several years between the government and the mob, until mafia higher-ups smoothed out the FBI's ruffled feathers by sanctioning several of their members. A close associate of Danny Marino, and also believed related to the Lombardozzi family, Johnny G. Gamarano, was active in labor union racketeering in the construction industry, shylocking, and extortion. His name came to prominence during the Gotti era when he was exposed as a soldier handling several union locals for their borgata. George Lombardozzi, Carmine's brother's son. Based in Brooklyn, he was heavily engaged in shylock, extortion, and business infiltration rackets. He was also another relative arrested in 1963 for beating up that FBI agent. George later figured into a federal loan shark extortion case in Brooklyn, which involved a Chinese restaurant owner who borrowed Shylock money from Lombardozzi and was later pressured by the FBI. Michael Scandifia was a close associate of the doctor from the 1950s to the 1960s. A high-profile soldier, he apparently fell afoul of his mob superiors. He disappeared one day in 1968 and was never seen again. At the time, he was entangled in several investigations and indictments for diamond theft, stock fraud, and illegal guns, among other charges. It is said his murder was a direct result of him having either become an informer or the fear that he would become one. Joseph George Blue Eyes Martinelli. Born in 1914, he was a Brooklyn resident until later relocating down to Miami Beach, Florida. Active in gambling, shylocking, strong-arm, and stock frauds, Martinelli was indicted in 1962 with John Lombardozzi and other crew associates for a major stock theft from Bash & Company, a top Manhattan brokerage house. Accursio Swifty Marinelli. Born in 1911, Swifty was one of Carmine's closest associates for many years, active in policy, shylocking, and thefts. He was also closely affiliated with capo Peter Petey Palms Ferrara, a Carlo Gambino intimate. Louis D. Filippo. He engaged in stolen stocks, frauds, scams, and shylocking. Dominic Mundo. Almost solely active as a major loan shark, he was a top member active in pushing Carmine's money out in loans throughout Brooklyn. And Ernest Cutface DeVito. Born in 1920, Cutface DeVito was active in robberies, extortion, labor rackets, policy, and strong-arm work throughout Brooklyn and Manhattan. He was also known to have been friendly with the family's Corby regime based in Baltimore, Maryland. And there were many other soldiers in Lombardozzi's crew not named here. He also had numerous associates as well. Many were white-collar criminals active in stock thefts and various frauds and allied with Lombardozzi's regime in these operations. Some of these associates included Milton Parness, a master conman and stock fraud specialist, Benjamin Benny Cutler Kutlowitz, an old-time Jewish hood from Brooklyn, and Leo Isaac Segal, a stock fraud specialist, among many, many more. Carmine Lombardozzi was a master at white-collar type rackets, stock fraud, bankruptcy scams, business infiltration and corruption, labor union embezzlement, and sweetheart contracts with employers, etc. That said, many of his confederates and partners in these activities, although illegal, were mostly corrupt businessmen and other fringe players of the underworld. Lombardozzi's crew also operated down in South Florida, Connecticut, California, Las Vegas, and elsewhere, often far away from the mob's epicenter of New York and New Jersey, which often allowed for successful anonymity. Carmine the Dr. Lombardozzi died uneventfully with little fanfare in 1992 at the age of 79. After Lombardozzi's death, his crew was taken over by his nephews Danny Marino and George Lombardozzi. They continued the tradition started by their uncle, successfully expanding the crew's rackets and operations through the years. The second generation carried the infamous Lombardozzi name and were well received by New York's underworld because of it. But the caveat was that the Lombardozzi name was a bit of a double-edged sword, cutting both ways as it were. On the one hand, the surname opened up a lot of underworld doors, but on the other hand, it brought them under the intense eye of federal law enforcement scrutiny. They received much more exposure than might have been had they not had such a notorious underworld history and infamous mafioso surname. Starting in the 1980s, all throughout the 1990s and well into the 2000s, Marino and his cousins George Lombardozzi and John Gamarano would be arrested and indicted over and over for a variety of offenses. Among the more noteworthy charges and criminal cases involved were loan sharking, extortion, labor union racketeering and corruption, and murder conspiracy. There were many other lesser counts as well. Each would be repeatedly prosecuted and jailed, with Marino suffering the longest periods of incarceration. Their mafia road has not been paved with gold as in the days of old with their uncle Carmine. Carmine Lombardozzi led an interesting underworld life indeed. You can read more about him and members of his crew at Button Guys of the New York Mafia website at www.thenewyorkmafia.com. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode of Mob Fireside Chat. Thank you for watching. Until next time.